will.
Where do you go?
Just up here, Marquette River.
Okay.
Senator Rockland, Dan Merrick, Steve Schmidt, National Association of Beverages. Another actor. Yeah, really. Yeah.
Stop and get a bite to eat.
Yeah, I think you really like it. A lot of good stuff.
Good morning. Hey, how are you? Good. Brandon Denning. How do you do?
Good morning, everybody. I think we'll get started. If everybody could find a seat. I want to thank all of you for joining us for our third in a series by the Center for Alcohol Policy, talking about the whole alcohol industry. Today's topic is what's going on in the world of alcohol deregulation. We've got a great panel for you, but I'd like to start out by introducing our lead speaker, Mr. Brandon Denning from Birmingham, Alabama. He works at Samford University in the Cumberland School of Law. Brandon is nationally known and is nationally interviewed on all sorts of Supreme Court cases. You'll find him funny and engaging and have a big global historical view about what we've done in this country with alcohol, from taxes to public safety. So I'd like you to join me in welcoming our friend from Birmingham, Mr. Brandon Denning.
Good morning. Thank you all for coming, and I want to thank Pat for such a wonderful welcome and for his hospitality as I've been here. As he mentioned, I'm a law professor by trade, which means that at this time of the year I love to be in East Lansing because it means I'm not home grading exams. And I'm happy to talk to you all a little bit about, give you a little introduction to what the Center for Alcohol Policy does, and also maybe a short history lesson about alcohol policy and the Constitution. So what is the Center for Alcohol Policy? And I know some of you who've been to these have probably heard this before, so you'll excuse the infomercial, and I'll try to get through these slides pretty quickly. But we're an educational arm whose purpose is to educate policymakers, regulators, and the public about the unique qualities of alcohol, and also about the regulatory structures that we've created in the country to facilitate its sale and use and consumption by the public. We were launched in 2007, and we've been fairly active. We conduct an annual poll testing the public about its attitudes towards alcohol policy, both existing policy and also policies that are contemplated around the country. We do an annual CLE, a continuing legal education program in the fall that bring together a wide group of people, a broad group of people to discuss alcohol policy and the issues concerning both regulators and also distributors, wholesalers, and others. This year's program is September 9th through the 11th in Dallas, and if you haven't had a chance to go, you really should consider it. It's a very substantive program with a wide variety of perspectives, and it's really, last year's I thought was our best ever. We've been getting better every year, so please consider that. We have an annual essay contest on alcohol regulation, and this is one of the things that as a member of the advisory board I again do some grading, and these have been really interesting to see the response that we've gotten. Every year we've done it, we've gotten more papers, and I think the papers have gotten better over the years as we get better known. Last year, as many of you know, we republished a sort of landmark work in alcohol policy toward liquor control, which had been commissioned by John D. Rockefeller to fill the regulatory space that was going to exist after Prohibition was repealed. And we've gotten a lot of, it just so happened that we did it at the time that Ken Burns was releasing his documentary on Prohibition. Of course, anytime you get to piggyback on Ken Burns, you get a good reaction. Pam Erickson, who's on the panel today, has done some fascinating comparative work looking at problems with deregulation in the UK and sort of presenting a cautionary tale, I think, for those of us in the United States, particularly in states where deregulation has gained some traction. And if you haven't seen Pam's work, I commend it to you. Finally, we did, as I said, we got to piggyback on Ken Burns on Prohibition. We sponsored part of it. This is one of my colleagues on the advisory board, Patrick Lynch, the former AG of Rhode Island, with Ken Burns. And we're also sponsoring these forums, again, as a way to bring people together to have a conversation and about alcohol policy, about deregulation. And I think anytime you get people from differing views in the room, I think when you establish these bonds of trust and just have conversations, I think those are really productive. And so the first, we talked about economic viability in Michigan. Second, we talked about public health and safety. And I think that particularly the second, well, both of them actually. In the talk about deregulation, I think that there are two things that are often missed. First, the notion that deregulation will create economic growth. Well, maybe, but more often what's lost is the idea that there are no costs associated with deregulation. And I think that trying to show that there are two sides to that balance sheet is something that's often lost in that debate. Second, alcohol is a product that generates externalities that few other products do. And I think it's very important to keep the public health perspective in view. It's also important to keep the law enforcement perspective in view. And those two views often are sort of glossed over or lost sight of in arguments about deregulation. So today's panel is we're going to broaden the focus a little bit and talk about alcohol policy around the world, and also talk a little bit about the history of alcohol regulation here, because I think that in every system, there's a kind of inflection point in regulation where at some point the reasons for the regulation themselves have sort of passed out of mind. And so people begin to think, well, why do we have this system? It just seems like a kind of throwback or an atavism to a kind of earlier time, and it just seems like these they're old, they're archaic, we need to get rid of them, we need to replace them with something new. And I think remembering our history, remembering why we have this is an important part of intelligent discussion about where to go in the future. So just around the world, it's interesting to know that alcohol is completely illegal in 11 countries. Not surprisingly, in many Muslim countries, Iran, Afghanistan, Pakistan, and the like, although, as I'm sure you may have read, that there's plenty of ways to get alcohol in those countries. Drinking ages vary around the world. 16 countries with no legal drinking age. Many establish it at 18. The U.S. is on the fairly high range, a high end of the spectrum with the 21-year-old drinking age. But as is true of a lot of different kinds of policies, factors influence alcohol laws. Religion, ethnicity, climate, interestingly, is something that has a great influence on drinking habits and alcohol policies of countries around the world, which is not surprising. I mean, in the States, the upper Midwest famously, has a high concentration of people who enjoy to drink beer and wine and spirits, compared with, say, the state of Alabama, which I suspect we have a slightly higher than average population of abstainers. And history. And history is the thing that I want to emphasize quickly here this morning. The reason that the 21st Amendment exists, and the reason that we have the system of alcohol regulation in this country that we do, relates to perceived abuses in the 19th century. Not just perceived, I think they were real. You had abuses, well, I'll set it up this way. The Supreme Court in the late 19th century began interpreting the Commerce Clause in a way that made it very difficult for states to regulate the interstate shipment of alcohol. Even when states would go dry, the people who wanted to drink were able to get it shipped to them by rail. And as one historian sort of put it, that express mail offices at train stations were often little more than liquor stores. And it gave rise to jokes about people who would go pick up shipments of liquor, and somebody told a guy who came to pick up his package, Professor, your box of books is leaking, So I mean, so the Supreme Court made it very difficult to do. Congress responded by passing a series of laws, the Webb-Kenyon Act, the Wilson Act, which attempted to divest liquor of its interstate character so that states could regulate it. At the same time, so states were having a hard time on the regulatory side. At the same time, you had industry abuses, you had tide houses, you had the free lunch, come and get a free lunch, and everything that we serve you is going to be so salty that you're going to drink a lot of beer. There was concern by women's organizations that this was this sort of unrestrained alcohol consumption was harmful to the family. The growing voice for women gave rise to a temperance movement that really gained traction around the time of the First World War and ended up with the ratification of the 18th Amendment, which inaugurated prohibition, the country's experiment with prohibition. That wasn't successful, as you know, and it led to the passage of the 21st Amendment. So, sort of unique in the Constitution, we have 2 amendments, and there are only 27, and the first 10 were passed pretty quickly. So after 1791, we've had 17 amendments, 2 of which, over 10% deal with alcohol, deal with a single product. And when the 21st Amendment was being debated, there was a real concern on the part of states that they would go back to the era prior to Prohibition, where the court's interpretation of the Dormant Commerce Clause would not allow them to regulate alcohol for their folks. And what alarmed both sides, actually, what alarmed people was Section 3, which gave the federal government concurrent regulation over, it was an anti-saloon provision. It gave the federal government concurrent regulation over the consumption of liquor where it's sold. Both dries and wets in the Senate demanded that part be stripped out. They wanted to reaffirm state control over alcohol. And they feared that if the federal government got involved, wet states were fearful that the dries would take over again and not let them sell alcohol to their folks where it was popular. The dries were concerned that the wets would take over and require or prohibit states from regulating alcohol they wanted. So it's not quite the Baptists and bootleggers kind of phenomenon, but it was both sides demanded that this provision be stripped and that state control be the rule. And guess what? It's worked fairly well. 80 years. The 21st Amendment ensured that local control would be the rule. People get to decide you know, in East Lansing, in Michigan generally, in other states, the extent to which they want alcohol sold and under what kinds of rules. And according to the poll that we do every year, there's an overwhelming, almost 3/4 of people are perfectly, you know, understand that alcohol is a different product and needs rules. And there are lots of different groups. And again, this is, as I mentioned a few minutes ago, this gets lost in the debate. Alcohol is a different product. The framers of the 21st Amendment recognize that. I think people, when they think it through, recognize that this is a product that many of us enjoy very much. But at the same time, that it has to be regulated because it does generate the kinds of externalities that few other consumer products that we sell or allow to be sold in this country do. So lots of people have stakes in this debate, and it's important that those voices get heard. One approach was what the authors of Toward Liquor Control came up with. The system that most states retain today, the 3-tier system, which ensures that there are a lot of checks along the way, that they're, you know, they try to build safety into the program, try to build controlled access, but access nonetheless into the safe. We all been very kind to listen to me for this wind-up, and I'm going to turn it back over to Pat so he can introduce today's panel. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Before we head on, I just want to personally thank Amy Wells and Kathleen Joyce from the Center for Alcohol Policy for being with us and helping us out today. And as we head into this discussion, just throw out a comment that was made by your colleague on the advisory board a month ago, Brandon Jim Hall from Tennessee, who said, we've been arguing about regulation since the 10 Commandments. So with that, we'll head to our first speaker. It's my honor to introduce Steve Schmidt. Steve's from Pennsylvania. He's the Vice President of the National Association of Alcohol Beverage Control. And NABCA is the group that Michigan is a part of, all the control states that control alcohol in the way, much the way we do. And I'd like you to give a warm welcome to Mr. Steve Schmidt as he gives us a global view about what's going on with deregulation and regulation.
Well, thanks. It's really a pleasure to be here in Michigan. As Pat said, Michigan is one of the states that is a member of ours. Chairman Deloney is on our board of directors. So we have a lot of interest in Michigan as well as we do the other control states. But I'm probably going to give you a little bit for the policy nerds in the room today. Mine will be the presentation. I'm going to try to put this in some national perspective for you because there are some broad themes going on within the United States, especially, that we believe at NABCA is really driving the activity to deregulate beverage alcohol, to treat it as a product that is the same as every other consumer product, which we know is not the case. So let me talk about, real quickly, I'm going to hit on 5 themes in giving this global or this really national view. And not any one of these things is all that terribly bad or all that terribly good. But I have to tell you that when you take them all together and you put them into the mix, they really do begin to create a perfect storm for the kind of conversations and the kind of changes that could be very drastic for states. For those of you that follow this issue closely, you probably are aware that the state of Washington passed an initiative in November privatizing their system entirely, but I will tell you that the privatization of those state stores was only a small piece of what occurred as that part of that initiative. It was a broad sweeping deregulation of the alcohol environment in that state. And you'll see that some of these things will resonate in Michigan, some will not. But these are issues that we track, we viewed as having an impact in most of the debates around deregulation around the country. So the first one I want to talk about is anti-government sentiment. Certainly if you're a member of Congress, you understand this. If your approval rating is at 11%, but around really, whether it be at the local, at the state, at the federal level, the general public just right now doesn't feel necessarily real good about government. And you know, even if they do, and here's an interesting point I want to make, even if they feel good about it, they're not going to publicly tell you that. They may have wonderful experiences with individual public servants, but when you ask them the question, how do you feel about government in general? Much more negative rating. There's there's political science research that shows that. So even if they're okay with it, they're not going to publicly say that. The other thing about anti-government sentiment is that what you hear often in states where alcohol regulation is robust, maybe it's something that somebody doesn't like, you immediately get you start to hear things like, these are antiquated laws, these are archaic laws from prohibition, we live in a nanny state. You know, you hear a lot of names thrown around. And it really, again, is directed at the role government has in alcohol regulation. Second pressure, and this is real. There are very, very few states that in the last 5 to 6 years have not experienced significant pressures on their budget, significant pressures to find revenue. And this has had a great deal to do with the desire of states to take over control systems or get the state out of the business of alcohol, give it to private business. Most of it primarily, though, has been driven by getting revenue for the state. In the state of Virginia, the state of Pennsylvania, as they discussed privatization at the beginning, it was pretty much all about getting an infusion of cash. That's a pretty good soundbite, but it's pretty simplistic also when you look at the long run, what you give up in revenue, what you give up in the ability to generate revenue into the future. And by the way, also what you would necessarily incur as a result of increased need to regulate when you open a system up like they are going to do in Washington. So state budgets, the pressures on finances at the local, state, and level have also had a lot to do with this drive towards deregulation. The other part of that, of course, is the desire to create jobs, and the idea being that if we turn more of this over to the private sector, if we allow more outlets, if we allow easier access, that will create jobs. Brandon talked a little bit about that economic issue. I know Pam is going to talk about that, so I won't necessarily hit on that as much today, but understand that we see that throughout the country as well. The third issue, and I will tell you that this is something that has changed quite a bit in the last decade or two. And it's been really the rising influence of the big retailer, of their business model. And that is something that it is not bad for the consumer, certainly to have less expensive items, to have more access to a larger selection of items, to have a place where they can go to get all of the items that they may want to purchase. That certainly is not a bad thing from a consumer convenience, consumer satisfaction standpoint. But when you begin to understand what might drive harms around alcohol, things such as maybe less vigilance around being sure that underage persons aren't buying. If you think about cheaper prices, larger volume products, these become concerns for those that are interested in being able to reduce the harm related to alcohol. The systems in place do an awfully good job. The three-tier system does an awfully good job of keeping dangerous products out of the marketplace, making sure that there is a robust selection of product, making certain that it is handled appropriately by those that are involved. And unfortunately, the large retailers view this product just as they view any other consumer staple. In fact, and I'm not sure if Pam has it yet in her PowerPoint, but this past week, the Costco, one of the largest wine buyers in this country, made the point that wine, we will buy wine the same as we will buy toilet paper. They really don't view any difference in these products, in the way they do the business, in the way they, and by the way, for those of you that are wine lovers, that should really give you concern, because in that discussion and interview, there was really, I think, a ready admittance that, you know, we're not sure we really think there's all that much difference between a $5 bottle of wine, a $20 bottle of wine, a $30 bottle of wine. You know, we're going to get what the consumer wants, put it out in the marketplace, but we should have the ability to buy and distribute that in the way we would do that with any other product. So certainly that model, you begin to hear about that model in their discussions about the products as well. And the general public, you often will hear the same thing. That, you know, I don't see any reason why it shouldn't be treated the same, or I shouldn't be able to buy it in the same place I buy all my other groceries. These last two, I think, probably might seem a little bit more obscure to you, but I would argue may very well be one of the most important underlying factors for why we don't think alcohol regulation is, maybe it's lost, maybe it's not kept up with the times. The first is, I refer to it as alcohol abuse apathy. First of all, what you should know is about 1/3 of all Americans don't drink at all. About 1/3 are very light drinkers. And then there's a third that are pretty heavy, you know, heavy, moderate, sort of on the edge consumption. So there's about 67% of the population that, quite frankly, don't deal with and really are not sure they really care a whole lot, because they themselves don't purchase, they themselves don't certainly use alcohol. It's not a big part of their lives. So, you know, to them, this concern about alcohol harm doesn't really strike home, unless, of course, they've been a victim or someone close to them has been a victim. The other thing I want to point out is I think the 3-tier system and alcohol regulation in the United States has worked pretty darn well. We don't have a lot of bootlegging. We don't have a lot of Confederate products in this country. We don't have a lot of the black market that you see in other countries around the world that, quite frankly, is deadly. Every once in a while, you hear about some interesting moonshine experiences. You may even hear about sicknesses, but it's something that is really foreign to us in the United States. But I guarantee you, in parts of the world where there isn't the type of system in place, or systems are being broken down, it is a very important issue and one they need to try to get a handle on. Right now, Russia is getting ready to increase taxes, increase controls. The system has been out of control. We see that certainly in the UK. Pam's going to talk about it. I'm pretty sure that once those mechanisms are put into place to reduce access back to a level that is safe, you're going to see an increase in the kind of black market and the increase in the kind of dangerous products that should give concern to public health. We don't ever want to get to the point where we have to do that in the United States or in any other state. So this is an important issue to keep your eye on, making sure people understand the alcohol, when not used appropriately, which is by a minority of our population, can have significant harm. Now, I would suggest to you that this plays its way into consumer and media perceptions. You don't see nearly the kind of, you don't see nearly the type of concern in the media that you saw maybe in the late 80s, early 90s around things like drunk driving. You see some underage drinking stories. It's certainly in the media. But for the most part, the media really isn't nearly as engaged in looking at what the true activity is or the true harm being caused by alcohol. And it's important to keep that in context. It's important to keep that in front of the public. It's important to keep that in front of policymakers in order to create appropriate debates about this issue and to balance the approach. What I want to run here is a video. Nope, it's not. Well, the video I was going to run there is just, quite frankly, another example of a advertisement that ran in the state of Connecticut that really discussed alcohol and restrictions on alcohol the same way they talk about, well, would you want these kind of restrictions on toilet paper? Would you want it on car batteries? Would you want it on other consumer staples? Again, the idea that this product is no different. And what the last words I would leave you with is that it's not that we need to make significant strides to pull back, but we have to balance. our policy. We have to balance our activities when it comes to alcohol. Regulation can become onerous. Regulation certainly is something that we have to be certain is balanced with the appropriate consumer satisfaction and the consumer experience. And I think that's what you're really striving to do here in Michigan. And I really want to commend those of you that put this session together to really keep a balanced view on this issue and keep a balanced approach to alcohol regulation as you move forward. There are some states that are really struggling because there isn't a balanced discussion like this one. And it's important that that's how we move forward when we think about alcohol regulation. You want to try and run it? Yeah, be a great way to end it.
Bear with me for a second.
You realize you can't buy those today. It's Monday.
Yeah, I can only sell fluorescents on Monday.
Oh,
It's Tuesday. You know I can't sell you cookie mix today.
Really? I got all the way down there and they couldn't sell me any toilet paper.
What? Why?
It's against the law. They can't.
you realize you can't buy those today. It's Monday.
Yeah, I can only sell fluorescents on Monday.
Oh,
It's Tuesday. You know I can't sell you cookie mix today.
Really? I got all the way down there and they couldn't sell me any toilet paper.
What? Why?
It's against the law. They can't sell me toilet paper on Wednesdays.
What if normal, everyday products were regulated according to days of the week? It may seem like a ridiculous idea, but because of outdated blue laws that ban the sale of alcohol on Sunday, that's exactly what's happening in Connecticut. Ending Connecticut's ban on Sunday sales would mean more convenience for consumers and new jobs for workers. It's time to put Connecticut consumers first. Visit nctbluelaws.org and find out how you can help pass Sunday alcohol sales today.
And 2 chocolate shakes, please.
Can't do the milkshake, sir. It's Thursday.
So just one regulation, one law, not necessarily a bad thing to do away with blue laws, but the point being that this debate is being framed as alcohol being no different than any other product. And I think that's an important thing to keep in mind as you think about these policies moving forward. So thank you.
Thank you, Steve. When you think about blue laws, when I entered the legislature in 1982, I never thought we would see Sunday mornings available for alcohol sales in Michigan, but times have changed and now that's happening. Next on our panel, we have a young man who I've watched his career since he was a young staffer over in the Capitol and has now grown up to become and be named by our present governor, Governor Snyder, as the chair of the Michigan Liquor Control Commission. And he's doing a great job. Let's all welcome Mr. Andy Deloney.
Thanks, Pat. Yeah, when I started on House staff, Pat was the, if I remember correctly, the House Democratic floor leader, and always knew Pat as one of those guys who on the floor or in committee would be a very fierce advocate for what his constituents wanted, and he could very strongly disagree with you in the floor or in committee, but once floor was done, once committee was done, you know, share a joke, have a good friendly word afterward, and it's always good to work with people like Pat. So Pat, thank you very much for inviting me to be a part of this morning. Really appreciate it. As Pat said, I was appointed by Governor Snyder as an administrative commissioner to the Michigan Liquor Control Commission and was asked to serve as chair. And it is truly an honor, and as Pat certainly knows, it's truly an honor and very humbling to be asked to serve the state in that capacity, and I am really enjoying it thus far and really looking forward to tackling the challenges that we have and the future challenges that we have. while the focus of this panel certainly is regulation, and of course we have a very strong role in terms of regulatory policy, that doesn't really seem to be the focus of why I was appointed or why I was considered by the governor to be chair of the Liquor Control Commission. Certainly, again, we have a very strong role in regulation. We will continue to have a strong role in regulation. Of course, there will continue to be work on regulatory policy. But it seemed the things that really the governor was hearing about when he was on the campaign trail and when he was transitioning to governor after the election were things like the licensing process. How long does it take an applicant to get a license in the state of Michigan? What are our processes and our procedures that we have in place? And really, those have been our focus since I was appointed, and also since Governor Snyder appointed Terry Quimby, another Republican to the commission. So I'll just spend a couple minutes talking about really what our focus has been and what we're going to continue to work on. But before I do that, I kind of want to tell you a little bit about what we see as our guiding principles and what we think about on a daily basis when doing our work. Our guiding principles, the first one is the creation, and I'll talk about this more in just a moment, but the creation of simple and predictable processes for licensing and permitting. And again, we'll talk about more of that in just a second. The second is a focus and a dedication to a process of decision-making and governing and operating based on what the statutes and the rules actually say. I come from legislative staff and in the private sector worked in the legislative process. Again, Commissioner Quimby, who was appointed, she came from the legislative process as well, and that's something that means a lot to all of us, to both of us, I should say, and that is really driving our efforts. There's a lot of benefits, we think, to following what statute and rule actually says, one of which, and not the least of which, is creating a system of predictability and certainty about how the commission is going to be making decisions. If the statute or the rule is clear, well, chances are that's exactly how we're going to make our decisions. And also, if we make a decision and somebody does not happen to be in agreement with what that decision is, you'll be able to look to that particular statute or rule that will be able to tell you this is what is guiding that decision. Third is an open and accountable governance and operations. Fourth is the creation of a culture, and I'll talk about that word in a second, but a culture that, for our staff, that we fully enforce the laws of this state, but avoids the us versus them mentality, where we are the government and we are against those in industry, whether they're a supplier or a wholesaler or a retailer, where we think they're trying to hide something. We want to create a culture where we work with those in the industry, where we would work with those who work with the industry, the health community, law enforcement community, to identify problems and develop solutions. Having worked in the restaurant industry for a number of years, I had the pleasure of working with an agency like the Michigan Department of Agriculture, where that is their culture. And that's not to say that the vast majority of our enforcement investigators and our staff don't, but we really want to make that our culture. We want to make that a part of their daily operating procedure. And again, working with an agency like the Michigan Department of Agriculture for so many years, that is their culture. They work with those in industry, they work with those who regulate industry and who study the industry to identify problems and develop solutions together. And finally, we really want to be a part of an environment where we work with our staff team, where we make sure that they are comfortable sharing ideas, coming to us and saying, I really don't understand why we do things a certain way. In the governor's State of the State address, he talked about the importance of employee engagement, and that is something that we fully believe in at the commission, and that has already been taking place in a number of ways, and I talk about licensing in just a second. I'll expand on that. But again, the two main priorities that we've had since we've been appointed the licensing process and our orders and procedures. And again, the licensing process is one that I was familiar with, and that is our #1 focus. When I came to the commission, on average, if you applied for an on-premises liquor license, on average, it would take about 85 days. I'm sorry, could you hand me my glass? It would take on average about 285 days to process that application. If it was an off-premises application, it would be 10 to 15 days less than that on average. We decided that we can certainly do a lot better than that. The process was not created overnight. It took decades to get to the process that we have, and so we know it's not going to be solved overnight, despite the calls to solve the problem tomorrow. Every once in a while we hear from somebody, sometimes legislators, who think that we should be able to take an application in one day and the very next day issue a license. It doesn't work that way, but we are working at that as our top priority. And part of our governing philosophy here is, again, a lot of the problems are going to be solved administratively, internally, by, again, focusing on what the statutes and the rules actually say. Some of the things that we've been able to do thus far, and again, our staff teams have been very instrumental in this, because again, they've been able to come to us. We actually put together teams of staff to come to us with recommendations on things that they would like to see changed, where they're saying, we don't understand why we do things this way, or we've got some better ideas on how we could do this. They gave us, our licensing team gave us a whole menu of reform options that we took a look at, and we are now in the process of implementing. Similarly, our enforcement investigators are in the process of doing that right now. They just presented us some reform ideas where they're saying, we don't understand why we have to check for this, and do we really need to look for that document, and why can't we just, instead of being quick to pull out the citation book, can we not just sort of work with the applicant or the licensee to say, this is something you need to address before it becomes a problem? And they are in the process of finalizing those that we hope to have implemented in the next couple of months. We've created things like consent agendas. Again, coming from the legislative process, when you talk to things like Sunday sales, when that legislation a couple years ago was passed that created a Sunday morning sales permit, the legislature was clear. They saw two things being important in order to get a permit. Of course, you need to be a licensee, but you have to fill out an application and you need to pay the fee. That's all that's required. Why they were being sent out for investigation, I'm not really sure. So even those were taking several weeks, if not months, to process. So staff and the commission together came up with a way to create what we call the consent agenda for several different kinds of licenses, permits, and kinds of permissions that you need from the commission. If you present us with everything that's required, there's no reason why the very next day can't be on our agenda for approval. So if you're a store or you're a bar and you want to get a Sunday morning sales permit, you come to the commission with your application, it's completed, you have your check, the next day it's going to be before us for approval. And again, that was an idea that we had at the commission, but it was the staff that really said, hey, we have ideas on how we can put it together. Working with our staff team, they've been able to make that change. We've been able to eliminate, so far, I think about 15 forms, reducing the amount of paperwork. And that's something that's just going to continue to take more work. But we've been able to eliminate about 15 forms so far in the licensing process. Elimination of things like what used to be called licensing agreements, that particularly off-premise retailers, if you were a retailer and you applied, you were going to be looked at for if you had a barber shop or a bank or a photo studio in your store. The commission for decades had been looking for things like, well, we want to see the agreement between the bank and the store to see what's going on between those two. And again, working with staff, we essentially said, well, why? Why is that holding up the process? Why do I need to know the arrangement between Chase Bank and XYZ retailer? What's that all about? And we've essentially decided if it's not a core central function to our ability to ascertain what's going to happen when it comes to the sale of alcohol, we don't need to check for things like that. And we've eliminated a whole host of these kinds of licensing agreements. It was mostly on the off-premise side, but even we've had situations where we were aware of a restaurant and they just wanted to feature the artwork of a local artist on one of their walls, and they just wanted to be able to make a couple bucks selling some of their paintings. Well, we were holding up the approval of the liquor license so we could see what the arrangement was. We wanted to delve into every minute detail of that. We just finally decided we don't need to be getting into those details. We want to be able to do, and we have been able to do, fast track approval for things that are known as participation agreements in the statute. Oftentimes in the industry, people own the restaurants, but they don't actually operate them. There are a lot of individuals and companies who are in the business of managing facilities. And there's oftentimes, of course, a contractual relationship between the owner, the license holder, and the company that's coming in to provide the management of it. We're doing fast track approval. What the statute says is if you're the management company and you're taking 10% or less of the gross sales, all we have to have on file, all we have to have is the agreement. We don't need to investigate it. That's not what the statute says. It just says that we have to have it on file. So we're able to do fast track approval and consideration of things like management agreements, which again are becoming a bigger part of the industry. Again, it took decades to get where we are, and it's not going to be solved overnight, but we are confident that at the end of our work, we are going to have a process for licensing and permitting that is going to be efficient, it's going to be fair, and it's going to be predictable. It's not just about the speed. Again, if you had a process that took 5 days, there's going to be someone who's going to raise their hand and say that's garbage. It should take 4 days. You should be able, if you're someone in business and you're going to operate, you're going to be a supplier, you're going to be a wholesaler or a retailer, you should be able to make business decisions knowing how long about it's going to take to get a license. If it's a wide open process where you don't know if it's going to take you a couple months or if it's going to take you a couple years, that's something that that's not acceptable and we're going to be addressing. The second other big part of our focus has been orders, procedure, processing, and it sounds very sort of boring and mundane, and of course, not being an attorney, sometimes, yeah, it tends to glaze your eyes over, but it's extremely important. Being a regulatory agency that we are, we speak through our orders. If someone makes a request for a declaratory ruling from the commission, if we issue an administrative order, if someone applies for a license and we deny that license, it's extremely important that our order states exactly what the view of the commission is and what that decision is being based on. When you look at our orders, they're all going to be uniform in appearance now. Again, that sounds very simple, but they're all going to be uniform, they're going to be clear, they're concise, and they state exactly the statutory or the regulatory provision that is the decision or that is the basis for our decision, so that if you're an applicant, if you're in the public health community, if you're in law enforcement, if you're in local government, or you're working for another state, if you're just someone in the general public, you'll know what the statute or regulatory provisions are that are driving our decisions. So that is a very important part of what we're focusing on, and it will continue to be going forward. Other things that we're looking at, technology. It's a buzzword to talk about, and certainly, as we know, Governor Snyder is a big proponent of improving our technological capacity. And at the commission, we're a paper mill. If you were to walk into that office, you just see row after row, aisle after aisle of files and folders and paperwork, and it's kind of amazing to see that we're still like that. Also, if you're a retailer and you purchase distilled spirits, we're on this old, ancient software system that I don't think anyone else in the world uses anymore. Well, we're in the process of upgrading that to a modern system, because if this system goes down, I mean, quite frankly, there's really no one who can back it up, because we're the only ones that use it, and there's, I think, only 2 people in the state who know how to program it. So we're updating our software for sales, inventory, and purchases of distilled spirits. And again, that's been our focus. Obviously, again, the interest here is regulation. Certainly, we expect the governor to be making a host of recommendations. I look forward to seeing what he's going to be proposing as well. And we look forward to working on those And of course, it's not just going to be our agency. We expect, of course, that some of these reforms will be in the statutory arena, which of course will require the legislature to consider those. So again, that's just a brief background on some of the things we've been focusing on. Process, procedure, our licensing system, and making sure that people who want to get into business are being thoroughly vetted, but are being fairly vetted and vetted efficiently so that they can get into business and be successful. That's our focus. That's really what we're going to be spending the vast majority of our time on. And I also want to thank Steve Schmidt from NABCA for coming. It is a pleasure to work with NABCA. I've really enjoyed being on the board of directors thus far. If your organization is not a part of NABCA, and I'll have to do my little sales pitch, but if your organization is not a part of NABCA, I would very strongly encourage it. The wealth of data and research that Jim Squeal and Steve and the rest of the team at NABCA provides really is unbeatable. First time I went to a NABCA meeting and looked at the kind of data that they're able to provide. If you're a supplier, a wholesaler, a retailer, or an association, you really should be a member of NABCA and make that stuff available to you. So again, I want to thank Pat and Kat for allowing me to be a part of this panel this morning, and thank you very much.
Thank you, everyone. Next on our agenda is a gentleman I have much respect for, worked with him for many years. He did 30 years with the Attorney General's office here in the state of Michigan, now with the law firm of Willingham Cote, and did a number of years. How many years did you work with the MLCC as a specified area, Howard? About 13, just with the MLCC. I'd like you all to welcome Mr. Howard Goldberg.
Thank you, Pat. I appreciate the introduction. I know everybody here has talked about Granholm v. Heald. I assume that most of you know what the central holding in the case was, but essentially, in a 5-4 decision, the court held that a state could not create a preference for an in-state producer, and producer is very important in the context of what I'm going to tell you about, and not that would work to the detriment of an out-of-state producer. We're talking about wineries, entities that produce wine, manufacture wine. Inevitably, I think, as I think about it now, Granholm led to the Siesta Village type case, where the same attorneys decided why not try and open every state's liquor market and wine market to retailers across the country. Again, a retailer generally does not produce anything. A manufacturer does. The distinction in Granholm would be you don't have a Commerce Clause violation if you don't have product discrimination. There was no product that was being kept out of Michigan as a result of the Commission and the legislature allowing Michigan retailers to deliver to consumers. Siesta Village Market, the little market on Siesta Key, Florida, wanted the ability, without a Michigan license, to ship directly into Michigan to Michigan consumers. They would have gone through none of Michigan's still rigorous procedures for licensing. They would be subject to none of Michigan's regulation. They just wanted to do it. They wanted to avoid Michigan's distribution system entirely. And again, a retailer is the point of ultimate contact with the consumer. I think the commission at the time that passed the rule and the legislature gave Michigan retailers the option of shipping directly to a consumer because they were subject to Michigan's system and enforcement procedure. Siesta Village didn't want a physical presence in Michigan. That's required for a license. There, at the time of the litigation, were 1,300 out-of-state, off-premise retailers, maybe a little bit in excess of that, who had a physical presence in Michigan. And on-premise licensees as well have to have the physical presence, clearly. One of the things that the commission did when this case was being litigated, and still does, is conduct decoy operations to determine which retailers, hopefully a smaller percentage, are selling to minors. Michigan now has the vertical driver's license for people under the age of 21. I think everybody under 21 has one. You still get the sales to minors. You can see from the data on the board, and this goes back to when we were in the thick of this litigation, there were a lot of decoy operations being conducted both by commission investigators and Michigan State Police and local law enforcement as well. Because the commission didn't have and still doesn't have the resources to do all of this, 55% of the licensing fees within a jurisdiction are returned to local law enforcement so they can help enforce the code and the rules. Under the code, the commission can, during regular, reasonable business hours, go in and conduct an inspection of a retailer's establishment. They can look for, and I'm giving you just a small example here, adulterated product, narcotics paraphernalia. They can make certain that the licensee is not selling to minors or intoxicated individuals. And there are many other health, safety, and welfare concerns that the commission investigators can look at. Some of the arguments that we dealt with in the Siesta Village case were that the Granholm case compelled the court to allow retailers without being licensed to just ship directly into Michigan. If you take a look at the Granholm case, you can see that there is substantial language that basically states that the three-tier system is still unquestionably legitimate, and the states each have the right to structure their alcohol distribution systems as they see fit, and to require that liquor sold for use in the state be purchased from a licensed in-state wholesaler. The plaintiffs in the Siesta Village retailer case in Michigan were arguing that they couldn't get the occasional very rare bottle of wine. That had nothing to do with the Michigan legislature or the Liquor Control Commission. Those were marketing decisions on the part of the wine manufacturers. The vast majority of wine sold in Michigan is from out of state. In addition, after Granholm, if a winery had a direct shipper's permit and had applied for it and received one, the wine could come into the state directly to the consumer. We argued that if Michigan were to allow unlicensed out-of-state retailers, or even if they issued some sort of a license to them, there would be no regulatory authority such as every in-state retailer is subject to. Wineries, producers, are required to obtain a federal basic permit, and that can be revoked if they violate state law. And the winery is also required to show the Liquor Control Commission its permit so the state can verify the company is a bona fide winery. There is no such structure for retailers. Michigan does have a physical presence requirement for retailers. As I indicated, over 1,300 at the time of the litigation, headquartered out of state, had the physical presence here. One of the arguments we faced was, well, Siesta Village is subject to Florida's system, what's wrong with that? Every state has a different system. In my view, Florida's was much less rigorous. You can't compel the state of Michigan to rely on Florida's regulatory structure. The state of Florida, for instance, allows alcohol to be sold below cost. Michigan traditionally has held the view that that does not lead to responsible drinking. The Liquor Control Commission can make this determination because Michigan wholesalers are required to file the price of wine sold to Michigan retailers with the Commission on a quarterly basis. Michigan has no authority to impose any requirement like this on Florida wholesalers, and you couldn't determine whether a Florida retailer would be shipping in wine that would be sold below cost. One of the things we did during oral argument was to show the court the kinds of labels that would come into Michigan that were permitted in Florida. Michigan has rules regarding labeling. One of the things that the commission looked at, and I believe still does, is you don't want labels that would appeal to underage drinkers. We had a rather graphic exhibit. One of the bottles, I think it was a wine cooler, was labeled "Suck and Blow." The judge was outraged, apparently not outraged enough. In the interest of full disclosure, Michigan, the federal judge in Michigan ruled against the state. Identical arguments were made in New York in a very similar system, and the court, both the federal district court and the circuit court of appeals, second circuit, ruled in favor of the state. Pat will probably well remember that after we appealed to the Sixth Circuit, we sat down with the commission. They really did not want to risk having retailers from all over the country ship product in directly to consumers without being subject to any regulatory procedures under Michigan law. And of course, there's always the issue of attorney fees. I believe after Granholm, the state paid out, remember it had gone all the way to the Supreme Court, $825,000 to the plaintiff's attorneys. The Siesta Village matter, I think the attorney fees were in the area of $120,000. Commission did not want to risk that any longer. Went to the legislature and talked about remedial legislation. What happened was that Section 203 of the code was amended. Retailers, whether they're in-state or out-of-state, can ship directly to consumers only if they use their own employee, the employee verifies age, and has been subject to a Liquor Control Commission approved training program. What you have now is Michigan retailers who had been using common carriers to ship throughout the state suddenly have to use their own employees. For some of them, that's not practical, clearly. I think if you take anything away from all of this, as I did, when legislators and regulators look at carving out exceptions for in-state producers, they have to be very careful. Any rule or regulation that favors an in-state producer to the detriment of an out-of-state producer will be seen as protectionist and clearly be subject to a challenge under Granholm. What you'll have is a judge who may not understand what are very real health, safety, and welfare considerations, deregulating the whole system without any public debate or any public input. Even though we were talking about retailers, not producers, in our Siesta Village case, what you ended up with after the remedial legislation was that Michigan retailers could no longer use common carriers to ship wine throughout the state. I'd also argue that after Granholm, the state lost significant ability to regulate wine coming into the state. If you look at the figures for what's being declared by out-of-state wineries that hold Michigan direct shipping permits, they don't really jibe with what people believe the demand is. There is something going on here, or people just aren't ordering from out-of-state wineries. I think it's more likely that not everything is being declared. I think everyone is interested in creating more jobs. It's a very worthy goal, but I think you have to balance very important competing interests here. And keep in mind that the legislature has expressed the desire to protect the public health, safety, and welfare clearly in the Michigan Liquor Control Code. Thank you.
Extensively around the world on the subject of alcohol and alcohol regulation. Please welcome Ms. Pamela Erickson.
It's a great pleasure to be here and talk about this very important subject. This morning at 6:30, I did a radio interview with KMIJ here in Lansing, and the host of the program started by telling an alcohol story that impressed him. In 1991, he was a reporter, and he was called to the scene of a horrific accident where two cars were involved. They both exploded, and it was impossible to immediately identify the victims. He took his notes and then left, but later in that day got a phone call and found out that 4 of his friends from high school were involved in that accident. They all died, and it was an alcohol-involved accident. So that said to him that alcohol regulation, anything you can do to prevent these kinds of things from happening, you should do. This is not a product like everything else on the market. It's one that should be sold, marketed, and handled with a great deal of care. And my message to you is there is a cost of getting it wrong. So as you approach deregulation conversations, I ask you to think about the cost of getting it wrong. And rather than signing up for some kind of free market theoretical nirvana, look at some of the real world examples and what has happened when alcohol has been deregulated. These days, we are seeing a lot of discussion about deregulation. You've heard about Washington State that almost completely deregulated, but there are conversations in virtually all of our control states and in many licensed states. There are some states that control alcohol much more tightly than a lot of control states. Kansas is a good example, where the only place you can buy alcohol other than 3.2% beer is a liquor store. So there's some very, very tightly controlled states, and there are a lot of conversations going on there as well. What's driving all of this? Well, you heard a lot from Steve Schmidt about what is driving all of this. I think there are two primary things. One is the hyper-competitive grocery market, and the second thing is states and local areas desiring additional revenue. I want to talk a little bit about the grocery market. The grocery market is very, very competitive. The margins are very thin. Typically, a big box grocery store will have a net profit of less than 2%, and during the recession, it's been even lower. Some convenience stores actually aren't profitable, but because they're family owned, all the members are paid, they can make it work for themselves. But it's very, very competitive. Recently, you've got a lot of new entrants. Target is selling groceries. Everybody wants to sell groceries, and everybody wants to sell alcohol, because alcohol tends to be a higher margin product, and you can use alcohol as a promotion to get people into your store versus going to another store down the block. One of the things that is actually bad news for alcohol is the mass merchandising method for supermarkets. Supermarkets make their money off volume, not on markup. As I talked about, the profit margin for grocery stores is very, very small. The supermarket chains, particularly the large chains, they make a lot of money, but they make it on volume. So they have a very high incentive to sell a lot of alcohol to consumers. They want people to buy in volume. And of course, people don't decorate their house with alcohol, they drink it. So this is not a particularly good trend. So that's one of the reasons that we want to kind of tamp down a lot of the promotional activities in our retail establishments, because we don't want people to drink in high volume. Of course, governments are seeking additional revenue. We know that a lot of governments are dependent on the sales tax, and so they seek additional revenue through greater retail opportunities. And oftentimes they are persuaded by economic analyses that purport to create a lot more jobs and a lot more revenue for states. I've looked at several of those economic analyses, and I'm a former researcher, and I have to say I'm shocked at the poor quality of a lot of them. Certainly there are some reputable outfits out there that do a good job, but oftentimes they're horribly overblown, and you run the risk of not realizing the additional revenue once you deregulate, or create the kinds of jobs that are promised. If a store that doesn't sell alcohol now gets to sell alcohol, it's unlikely they will hire additional people. They'll just shove some slow performers off the shelf and add product to existing shelves. So it's very important to really look at those economic analyses and be absolutely sure that that's really going to pan out before you make a change. Another thing to emphasize, a point that Steve made, is that most Americans are not regular alcohol consumers. Almost a half of Americans either don't drink at all or drink only a couple of times a year. They'll have a glass of champagne at New Year's or maybe some celebratory occasion, but they just aren't regular drinkers. Another good chunk of the public drinks quite moderately, 3 drinks or less per week. That's not even a 6-pack. So you don't have a large portion of Americans that are buying alcohol on a weekly basis. So when you're advocating for consumers, you need to think about who are those people. Heavy drinkers, underage drinkers are the people that buy the most alcohol. That's one of the facts that we really have to face up to when we're thinking about selling this product. That unfortunately, people that have alcohol problems really buy a lot of the product. And we don't want to be expanding that group of people. So we need to be careful. If we're bringing people cheaper alcohol, the primary beneficiary are going to be the heavy drinkers and underage drinkers. Underage drinkers, unfortunately, 90% of their consumption is in the form of binge drinking. Not a good thing for our young people. Now I want to focus on my primary message, which is the high cost of getting it wrong. And I bring to you the example of the United Kingdom. And this is a quote from the current Prime Minister, David Cameron. He has dedicated himself to doing something about an alcohol epidemic that has come after 50 years of deregulation. I did a report almost 3 years ago called The Dangers of Alcohol Deregulation, the United Kingdom Experience. And this is available on my website. We're hoping to get copies available for you. If they arrive in time, they'll be on the table outside and you can pick one up. But in this report, I described a process where over 50 years, the United Kingdom almost completely deregulated alcohol. Alcohol today in the UK is sold 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. All forms of alcohol are sold virtually everywhere. And that has brought them an alcohol epidemic. By the time they realized it, they were in the throes of an epidemic. One of the things that happens is if deregulation occurs slowly over 5 decades, you don't notice the incremental changes until they've kind of reached a tipping point. Then you're scrambling around trying to figure out what to do. And in the early 2000s, what the government did was bought into a lot of untested theories. They ignored the advice of public health officials and decided that what they wanted to do was to create this cafe society. They looked at some of the Mediterranean countries, such as Italy, where a lot of people drink every day, but they drink rarely more than 1 or 2 drinks at a setting, and sometimes even less than a drink. So they wanted to create this moderate drinking culture. Now, no one really knows how to create a new culture. If you have a heavy drinking culture, no one really knows exactly how you transform that culture into something you like. But that was the idea. And so what they wanted to do was to just take away all the closing hours and Let's not have that last call and all the drunks spilling out at 2 o'clock. Well, what they got was drunks spilling out 24 hours a day. Police were staffed up for the closing hour. They had very thin staffs after closing hours, so it put a great burden on law enforcement. People began drinking even more heavily. The kind of binge drinking in town centers was so out of control that law enforcement officials often advised families, don't go into these areas because they're just plain dangerous. So this is the kind of alcohol epidemic that they were faced with. And some of the things that characterized the epidemic were, first of all, market forces. When you deregulate, you need to think about what kind of market forces are in play at this particular time and what's likely to happen. What happened in the UK was that 4 large grocery chains captured 80% of the alcohol market. This is 80% of what we call the off-premise market. But they even took part of the on-premise market because alcohol was so cheap that people started doing what's called preloading, which means they have a few drinks at home, you know, from that cheap booze they got to buy in the grocery store, and then they go out to the bars. And what you've seen in the UK is the traditional UK pub, which is a community institution, has been closing at a rapid rate. They've lost over 20,000 pubs since, I believe, 1970, and they're closing several bar closures a week. It's kind of a sad thing because the pub has been indeed a community institution. One of the ideas was, let's revitalize our town centers. As manufacturing left, as a lot of other industry left, let's revitalize this by having an entertainment district. Well, the idea was, again, to have the little cafes and the small wine shops and that kind of thing. But what happened instead was mega bars. Mega bars that have a capacity for 1,000 patrons or more. Very, very aggressive serving practices. Although it's been illegal since about 2003 to serve a drunk person in an on-premise establishment in the UK, there have been 3 convictions. You know, so that doesn't work really well. So things got really out of control. Consumption is one of the highest among European countries. Underage drinking rates are about twice ours. Deaths from alcohol-related issues have doubled since 1991. Hospital admissions have doubled in just 10 years for alcohol causes. So these are the kinds of costs that the United Kingdom has had to pay for deregulating alcohol. Another consideration is that should you get it wrong and should things get out of control, it's very, very hard to get your regulations back. Like the United Kingdom, we're a democracy. We don't just issue edicts and change things. It takes a lot of deliberation, it takes a lot of time, and we've done that because we find that deliberation helps make us wise decisions. I thought it was interesting in Russia, which has a horrible alcohol problem, but apparently they also had a big problem with casinos. After a number of years of problems, Vladimir Putin in July of 2009 simply shut them all down. He did offer that they could operate in some very remote areas, I assume in Siberia, but that just completely killed the casino industry in Russia. We don't do things like that. We have a different process. It takes us a long time. And so getting some of those regulations that actually worked to keep our marketplace in balance, to keep the problem under control, we will have a hard time getting them back. We also have a situation today where the industry lobbies are very powerful. They have a lot of money, and they will tell you only part of the story. Public health officials often are absent. One of the reasons they are absent is that they're all funded by some kind of grant that has a ban on lobbying. And even though they may be technically engaged in education, their fiscal agent will tell them to not even go to meetings. So oftentimes you won't even hear from public health officials. So you'll only get half the story. And finally, it really will pay you to be very, very careful about these decisions. Because even if you get additional revenue, it's unlikely that that revenue will be enough to cover the additional social problems that inevitably will occur. So as a summary, let me just kind of summarize my points about the price that could be paid for getting it wrong. First of all, we have a lot of research that tells us that increases in consumption, alcohol availability, will likely increase public health and safety problems. If you lower the price for alcohol, if you make it more available, those things will encourage additional drinking and inevitably bring you more problems. This kind of advice comes from public health officials like the Centers for Disease Control that have made those conclusions only after very careful review of credible research. Cheaper alcohol also can foster preloading, which means people would then be driving to a bar or an entertainment area impaired both before and after. So it could increase our problems with DUI. Another thing to consider, and that is the marketplace realities of today, that deregulation is most likely to benefit large out-of-state supermarket chains. Walmart, Costco, Kroger are the top 3 supermarket chains in the country. They will most likely benefit because they've got the purchasing power to work directly with the supplier to negotiate very favorable prices. They will be able to undercut your local mom and pops. They will lower the price for alcohol. A lot of times the general price may not be lowered, but because they often use loss leaders or specials, they're able to put alcohol products on sale. They do that to bring people into their store. So these are the kind of things that you need to be concerned about. You may be disadvantaging your local small business people who are voters in your state, whereas and send profits to out-of-state large companies. And then, of course, the additional revenue may not materialize. You've done all this, and then the studies that you relied upon actually overestimated the jobs and revenue to be created, and it just didn't materialize. So you need to be concerned about that and think about who's going to be advantaged and disadvantaged. Our alcohol control systems, I think, are really ingenious because they strive to achieve a balance that allows small operators, large operators, national firms, local firms to be reasonably profitable. So I think it's a good thing. In my state of Oregon, we have a flourishing wine industry and craft brew industry. And I am firmly convinced that without the 3-tier system structure, those industries would never have gotten a foothold. I've talked to some craft brew companies in Mexico, and they are having a terrible time trying to get their product to market because all of the bars and taverns have exclusive arrangements with the large beer companies, and they just can't get their product to market. They refuse to carry it in place that has an exclusive agreement. So those are the kinds of market dynamics that you need to think about when you're changing these regulations. And of course, in the long run, the cost is going to outstrip any kind of benefit or revenue that you may realize. Like people said, I developed an educational program. I have a website where you can download a whole series of products. I know that alcohol regulations are hard to understand. And I have to admit that when I was a regulator, I didn't totally understand them all. They're very complicated and they work in concert with the marketplace. So I have tried to explain a lot of these things in simple terms. I produced something called the issue briefs. It's available on my website. It's a series of questions and answers that we typically get in state legislatures particularly. And I've attempted to explain these regulations in simple terms. I also have a newsletter that I issue monthly, and you can sign up for that newsletter. So I'm going to conclude my talk today and turn it back over to Pat for questions and answers. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Pam. Do we have a mic here? Oh, down here. Questions or comments? Anybody want to start us off? Yeah, great. Would you mind getting on the...
I don't know. Do I need it? I can speak up loud.
Yes, you can. Go ahead. Let it fly.
My question's for Pam. I mean, you talk a lot about the UK, but you know, obviously there are some differences between the UK and the US. So I think one of the things that I've heard of people that have some problems or critical about what you've done is they say, okay, well, the UK is a different society from the US society, and things that are happening in the UK couldn't really happen in the United States. So I guess my opening question to you is, how do you defend yourself from that kind of line of attack on your work?
Well, I'm hoping that we don't follow that path. A couple things. One is that the market forces are very similar. Our grocery market is dominated by several very large chains, so I think we're vulnerable. But a couple things. It would be more difficult in the U.S. because regulation is state-based, and so you have to change every single state's regulations, and that certainly would be difficult. Another thing is that we have an ability in this country to be responsive when there are problems. We've gotten on top of the underage drinking issue a lot quicker than the United Kingdom did. Now it's pretty standard to enforce our underage drinking laws. When I became a regulator in 1996, the laws were not enforced at all. And a 15-year-old going in and buy their own beer. That's not true today. We have really focused people's attention on getting a handle on underage drinking, and drinking rates have come down and are at some of the lowest recorded rates. It's still way too high. We still have almost 20% of our young people binge drinking, but it's a lot better than it used to be. So we've done a good job. We've also done a pretty good job getting on top of drunk driving. We've got pretty strict laws in most of our states, and again, those rates have come down, but it's still quite high. Over 10,000 people lose their lives due to drunk driving accidents in this country. In contrast, in the two wars, we've lost a little over 6,000 people over a period of about 10 years. 10,000 deaths a year is just not acceptable. So we need to continue to be vigilant. But I think that when I was in the UK, one public health official said, you know, we don't form groups and have community organizations like you do in your country. We have a lot of community coalitions that really grab onto these issues, and I think that's a great thing. And you know, I think we're developing a better way of working together. As a regulator, I always worked with the industry, and I've been trying to get public health officials to also work with the industry. So I found that most people in business, they want to operate responsibly, and they don't want these bad actors in here ruining it for everybody else.
Yeah, I was going to say, Brandon, do you want to comment on that? I know you've done some teaching over in the UK. What have you seen in your years of going back and forth across the pond, as they say?
Well, I mean, what I found in my very unscientific research with the pub that was down the street from where we were housed, it's interesting. I got to know the landlord and landlady of the pub. Been a pub for 250 years, they think, at least. But some of the things that exist in the UK are different, like the tied house arrangement, for example. Most of the pubs that are still extant have exclusive arrangements with one or more of the breweries, and you can't get. It would be like going to a bar and only being able to get AB or Miller products, and so in those arrangements, where oftentimes the brewers actually own the property and you just lease it from them, they send you whatever they want. You got to pay for it. If you're not selling it, if it goes bad, too bad. You've got another shipment coming next week. So pubs have either closed or they've tried to sell food, become gastropubs. That was sort of the big trend. The problem there is that when your landlord, the brewers see you as being successful, they simply raise your rent. So it's very hard for people to make a living unless you're a free house, which is the term for a kind of owner-operated pub that can serve whatever you want. But again, very different, and something that is sort of shocking. If you find an ale that you like, you have to make sure to always go to the pubs that serve that ale, and that's very, very different from the U.S. So I agree with Pam. I think I agree with you that there are significant differences, but again, it does serve as a cautionary tale as to what would happen. Certainly not nationwide, because as Pam points out, federalism, right, works. But in individual states, I mean, you could very easily get to a point where if you're blasé or kind of dismissive about regulation or the importance of regulation, or you think that this is just some archaic throwback, you could end up with some very serious problems, in your society, and it affects. It actually does affect the sort of culture. I mean, there are places in England that are exceedingly unpleasant to go to after 10 o'clock at night, because you'll get harassed, at least, if not worse, by a bunch of drunken yobs, who are in a way that's not true in the U.S.
Kind of like a Dick's Last Resort on steroids. Any other questions? Questions or comments? I'll throw one at the panel. Then we have a think tank in the state called Mackinac Center that has been very critical of our system of regulation, calls it monopolistic, and a number of other comments. Does anybody want to take a swing at your feelings? I think everybody on this panel knows what they've been saying. They've been printed around the state of Michigan and around the country, taking on these, as Brandon would say, antiquated system of rules and laws. Anybody want to take a swing at that? That's a loaded question.
Well, I will.
Go ahead, Steve. Thanks.
Well, first of all, Mackinac Center is not alone. There are probably, certainly if not in every state, certainly in every region, there are think tanks, there are organizations that espouse whether you want to refer to it as libertarian, philosophy, free market. The Reason Foundation in the West Coast is the national organization. They actually do a series of reports. In fact, one of the reports they do is on privatization, and not surprisingly, each year that report includes discussions about alcohol, privatization, deregulation. But what I would want to say is, first of all, we do live in the United States and America. I think we're all certainly we are all entitled to our First Amendment rights to have a robust discussion about these issues. And I think the robust discussion is valuable in the long run, because I think what it does is it begins to give us a framework, or at least help us understand, you know, how complex this issue really is. Now, where I have my problem with those entities comes to the science and the research. What they often will do is they will cite data, say from one state, and compare it with another state on, let's say, underage drinking rates or drunk driving rates. And what they'll say is that, look, our rate is higher or no different than this other state, and that state doesn't have these controls in place, so these controls don't work. It's very simplistic. It is not scientific. It is certainly any researcher worth their salt will tell you there are so many other variables. So much goes into legitimate, peer-reviewed science that to even compare it to that kind of cross-sectional snapshot in time data really it's just should never be compared that way. But what happens, because what those organizations understand is that they need to get that message into the public consciousness, whether it's through editorials, whether it's by newsletters, that very often, whether it's the media, whether it's those of us that are policymakers, end up having this in one hand, and then legitimate peer-reviewed science from national researchers, whether it's the Centers for Disease Control, whether it's NIAAA, and we're saying, hey, well, this science is contradictory. Well, I would argue that it's more important to really take a very close look at that science and research, and to understand that if this snapshot in time data doesn't come anywhere close to this, well, you know what? This data is not legitimate. The science that has certainly robust scientific methods should be considered much more strongly than something that maybe a college intern or someone has done based on data that they find in several states, and make cross comparisons across states that really have not looked at the variables included, haven't looked at the culture of this state versus another state. Brandon talked about the different things that have gone into alcohol regulation over the years and what makes alcohol consumption different from state to state. So that's probably if there's one thing that I would really caution those looking at this issue closely, is to really dig and look at the numbers and the science that are being put in front of you. That's something I know as an organization we do to better understand whether or not two supposed contradictory types of literature or science should be contradicted or not. Really, there's one that is much more robust and another one that is not. And I think to compare the two is really not necessarily in the best interest of responsible regulation and policy going forward. So that, but again, I think it is important to have these discussions and debates. I just think it's important to put everybody's position in perspective and put the information they put in front of you in perspective.
Thank you, Steve. Anybody else want to take a crack at that one? Other questions? Greg?
One question for Mr. Deloney. I mean, you talked a lot about the licensing streamlining, and I agree. I think everybody who's been in the industry agrees that there are some aspects of the licensing that need to be changed. But I guess at the first session that I came to in this series, I heard an attorney talking about, like in Ann Arbor, how difficult it was to get a license and needing to hire an attorney. And I'm thinking, and he's saying that's a big problem, but I'm thinking the people in Ann Arbor are kind of in a unique situation. They've got a large university there that's comprising a big part of their population. So there's a lot of people there that are underage, so they probably want some say in what the life around the community is like, and they probably, are concerned about the access of alcohol inside the community. So I guess in the regulatory thing, is there still a role for the communities to have a say in how they want their community to be around alcohol? Are we saying as a state of Michigan everything has to be the same, and the people in Holland have to accept the same standards that maybe the people in Detroit want around the stadium, or is there still some local play in how alcohol is regulated?
Well, the short answer to your question is yes, certainly. And the main reason is because the statute says so. The Michigan Liquor Control Code confers upon local governments, cities, villages, townships, a role in approving or having a say in who gets a liquor license. To put more detail into some of the things that we're looking at, we're talking about internal administrative procedures, paperwork, things that we're doing. How many times do we need to get the same bit of information from an applicant? The Liquor Control Code says to, whether you're Ann Arbor, whether you're Manistee, whether you're the city of Detroit, or whether you're a very rural township, there is a role for that local government in determining who gets approved for licenses. And that's our job as the Liquor Control Commission, is to properly interpret, to make sure that we are implementing what the legislature has asked us to do, what has put in statute for us. I will say that the Liquor Control Code in many areas is not crystal clear. There are a lot of questions we have about this particular section of the statute seems to conflict with another section of the statute. But again, the short answer to your question is yes, there absolutely is a role for local government. Because as you say, one city is going to be totally different in terms of their structure, their demography, their local economics, how they hope to derive economic development than other communities. And the Liquor Control Code does confer upon local governmental units, cities, villages, and townships, a say, a role in the licensing process.
Thank you. Ronald, did you have a question?
Well, I just was going to take a shot at the Mackinac Center.
You could, well, if you're going to, why don't you take the mic? Would you give it?
I don't need the mic.
Well, we're taping this, so we want to hear everything.
Well, I just
we got to protect the innocent, you know.
Wanted to bring out the fact that the Mackinac Center does not even research their facts on laws that they're quoting within the state. They spout stuff out there of laws that, and they never, there's a lot of things that they have incorrect in there, as opposed to what actually happens in the state of Michigan.
Okay. Any further comments, discussions? This gentleman right over here. Just a second, we'll grab you a mic so we can.
This question's for Steve. You made a point about that the media is kind of, they're not bringing up alcohol issues as much. We're kind of desensitized towards it. How does that mesh with the fact that a lot of key indicators, be it underage drinking, and then the issues of drinking and driving, while there's still a problem, they've gone down a lot in the last 20 years or so?
Well, first of all, you're right. There are statistical, again, if you looked at the data, underage drinking has certainly been leveled out or reduced. If you look at impaired driving deaths, certainly they're down over the years. The one correlation I would make that I think it's important, and it's kind of our history of this. If you go back to the 1970s, 1980s, the rise of Mothers Against Drunk Driving, MAD, SAD groups that were really focused on the underage drinking or on the impaired driving issue. What you will find, and there was research done on this, you will find during that period of time there was a real peak in the media's attention to these issues, to the actual articles that ran throughout the country. And it's not surprising that this was also a period of time when we saw the greatest increase in laws to toughen drunk driving, to raise awareness, create more activity. So I will tell you that I think that the two moved hand in hand. You had certainly maybe from a sociological perspective, one of the most maybe one of the most successful interest group rises in our history at that period of time. And at the same time, media is moving with it. What I think I'm saying is that you still probably need, I don't think you can expect the media to take this issue on and run with this itself and increase the awareness on their own. They need to see that there is an interest in the public around these issues. Now, let me also say, though, that you're right, we're in better shape today than we were 20, 30 years ago in respect to underage drinking and drunk driving. But is it good enough? What I would argue is that if you had this increased attention, we would be saving even more lives. We would be keeping alcohol out of the hands of more children. We would be creating, brighter futures for younger people who end up getting involved in alcohol. So I don't like to say that, okay, we've been successful, so let's just kind of continue on this track. What we should do is take this as an opportunity to create, even better situations in respect to preventing underage drinking and impaired driving. It shouldn't really be good enough. And to say that, okay, now we can loosen this and that, and maybe it's not all that important because, we're doing a little bit better. That to me is not an acceptable strategy or an acceptable direction. And I would argue with my friends, by the way, I have friends on the industry side and in public health, and I would say to both of them, I would not go out there and say that, look, we've got this reduction, so, it's probably okay to, do away with certain restrictions or increase access. What we should be doing is looking to be smart about the way we do that and still create opportunities to create deep dives in those numbers. So for me, it's not good enough. And that would be my longer than short answer to that.
Mr. Tobias?
Yeah, good morning, panel. Thanks for being here. I appreciate the presentations. The last 5 or 10 years, there's been a lot of concern over flavored malt beverages, cheap, sugary, high proof, that appeal to usually younger audiences. Does anyone on the panel suggest what kinds of policy solutions to these products would anybody suggest, if anything?
Flavored malt beverages, anybody want to take a swing at that one? Pam?
That's a tough one. What I've tried to do is urge states to pay attention to their definitions. Definitions of alcohol determine where you can sell an alcohol product. The original idea after Prohibition was to foster moderation, and one of the strategies was to provide light beverages with widespread distribution. And at that time, light beverages was 3.2% beer, very weak beer, and many states took that kind of system where you make that available in grocery stores and other kinds of places, and then you assert much tighter control over more dangerous products, hard liquor, fortified wine, that kind of thing. That whole system is eroding. And I think you need to think about the value of that kind of system. Because I think it makes a certain amount of common sense to assert tighter control over products that might be more dangerous. And we're seeing products that we never contemplated that were certainly not available right after Prohibition. I would invite you to go to your grocery stores and your liquor stores and look at what's on the shelf. I mean, there are products I've never seen before. There are alcohol teas, there's sparkling sake, there's all kinds of alcohol products. Many of these aren't particularly dangerous, but you do see the tall cans of high alcohol content product very cheap. Those I would consider dangerous products, and it's not just kids. In many of our communities, we have major problems with street drinkers, and these are the kinds of things that street drinkers can't afford and are drinking. One of my liquor inspectors told me once that to take his kids to school, he had to drag the passed out drunks out of his driveway so he could get his car out. We just shouldn't live in communities where that's allowed to happen. And near his home, there were several stores selling a lot of these kinds of products. So I think it makes sense to pay attention to these products. It's not a simple one to try to figure out. In Montana, what they did is they did two things. They allowed higher octane beer, which from I think 5% to 8.5% to be sold in grocery stores, and that was for the craft brews. But they carefully defined beer so that it was indeed traditional beer. All other products over the 5 to 6% had to be sold in a liquor store. And that made it more difficult for kids to get their hands on some of the Alka-Pops with the high alcohol content. It's not simple, and the industry's very creative. They'll always come up with new products you hadn't thought of. So you need to be diligent, and you need to think about the value of a system that does assert greater control over products that may be more dangerous.
Thank you. Other questions or comments? I saw a hand over here. We had, yes, ma'am.
What should we make out of the fact that the students in California were drinking hand sanitizer? You say that we're making it easier or less easy for kids to buy alcohol. Are there people who say, I miss the days when I just had to take beer away from my kid, now I have to worry about pills and inhalants and hand sanitizer, apparently?
Go ahead.
I have to say I was shocked at that one too. I worked, right after I left the Liquor Commission, I ran a program to reduce underage drinking, and it was focused entirely on parents. It doesn't mean the rest of us don't have responsibility as well, but parents are really key in so many of these things. I am shocked that kids would take things out of the medicine cabinet. You know, these are carefully controlled products that should only be used under a doctor's order, but kids readily take them. I think parents need to weigh in and really assert more control over their kids, you know, issue them warnings. One of the research findings that we used was that parents are the most important influence over their child's decision to drink or do drugs. And that holds for a very long time. Kids really care what their parents think. And so I think we really need to rely on our parents for a lot of those kinds of things.
Thank you. And we were just a little bit after 10, and I promised everybody we'd get everybody out of here at 10 o'clock. And I had the real zinger question for you about the Amethyst Society. 200 college presidents, was it 200, Brian? That asked that we lower the drinking age, but I don't think we'll get into that one right now since we're after 10 o'clock. But I want to thank all of you for a very robust discussion about this issue. I know you're all busy, and several of you came in from out of state. We really appreciate it. I want to thank the Center for Alcohol Policy for doing this series. Hopefully, as you can see, I think there's a lot of discussion yet on the whole area of alcohol because, as we all know, it is a different product. And so we will hopefully carry these on in the future, but I hope everybody saw some value in our speakers this morning and give them a big hand. Thank them.
Pamela Erickson, P-A-M-E-L-A-E-R-I-C-K-S-O-N.
Just a little important. All right.
Okay. So if you could just talk a little bit about what the session today focused on and what your key messages were for the state and people considering alcohol regulation.
This was kind of a high-level view of alcohol regulation around the world and around the United States. And today we're experiencing a lot of discussions about alcohol regulation. And you see a lot of people talking about these regulations are antiquated and why can't we just get rid of them. And my message particularly is that alcohol, first of all, is a different product. It's a product that can create great harm. We still have over 10,000 people die on our highways every single year due to alcohol. So we need to think carefully about how we sell it, how we market it and promote it, how we use it, and think about whether or not these regulations make sense. We need to look at the research. We have a large body of research that really validates a lot of our alcohol regulations. That price makes a big difference, for example. So the idea that, you know, we could really lower the price for alcohol for our consumers here in Michigan, you need to think about that. Because first of all, who are those consumers? Well, at least half of Americans either don't drink at all or drink only maybe a couple of times a year. A glass of champagne at New Year's, for example. Another big chunk of Americans drink 3 drinks or less a week. That's not even a 6-pack. So the regular consumers are heavy drinkers, many of whom are underage. So do you really want to entice that group of people to be drinking even more? So it's something to think about very carefully. Cheap prices are things that our retailers offer people. Prices for groceries have gotten cheaper over the years. And you know, for most products, that's a good thing. That's not a bad thing. But for alcohol, it's something that should be considered very, very carefully. And things like making it more available, making it more convenient. Do you really want to have alcohol in every convenience store so someone can stop by and refuel a party, or they can have a few while they're driving home? You really don't want that. So I think my key message has been, when you change alcohol regulations, think carefully about what you're doing, because it may have very high consequences.